Taiwan Today with Natalie Tso.
Hello and welcome to Taiwan Today. I'm Natalie Tso. Today I speak with an expert on public speaking and negotiation, Nick Coburn-Palo. Nick taught diplomats at UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and is now teaching at the Taipei American School. Nick actually had a speech impediment when he was a child, so he tells us how he overcame that to become an expert at public speaking.
As is often the case, a great teacher presented themselves. I was someone who had a speech disorder when I was young. I was very difficult to understand. I think I would rather fight than speak, and pretty much stayed that way into junior high school. And
Really? I can't imagine that.
People say that now, but at the time, it was really a big problem, and I wasn't convinced I would ever be comfortable speaking. And I had a great teacher in 8th grade who required us to do an oral presentation, and I just wouldn't do it. And she finally said, you can do it on your favorite thing. Just pick your favorite thing in the world and talk about it. And it was the late 1970s. I had a baseball card collection. I loved baseball cards. And so I worked hard on it. I knew a lot about it. And although it wasn't perfect, it went much better than I thought it would. And she gave me a lot of confidence. And then she said, you did such a good job, you should try and go out for the debate team. And
Wow.
I was an athlete. I scoffed at that. That seemed crazy. But once I got the competitive element of debate, because I was a sports person thrown into it, and I had the confidence that came from that teacher, then I started being willing to do the work to invent drills to overcome my speech disorder and to practice them. And over time, I became a reasonably good speaker. And over a much longer period of time, it ultimately paid for my college education.
That's amazing. It's always so inspiring to hear these, success stories, especially coming from a challenging situation. So now you teach public speaking. You've taught it to diplomats. You teach it now to Taipei American School students. Tell us what you think is the key to great public speaking.
There are so many things to start from. I would say one of the root things is a love of words and a love of rhetoric. And ironically, it has less to do with speaking than with reading at a young age, I find. I find if you put literature and books in front of people and teach them a love of words, that often gives you a skill set. It gives you a vocabulary, literally and figuratively, you can fall back on as a public speaker, because so many of the problems with public speaking, and people speak of it like a fear of death. The studies even say that people fear public speaking more than death. Now, that's a misnomer.
That's silly, isn't it?
Because, it's more immediate. Well, death is very distant. Public speaking is something we deal with all the time. But it's that lack of confidence. And if you feel like you have the words, if you feel like you know the subject matter, and if you get the practice in, it will never be easy. But it's like with courage, any aspect of courage. First, you have to do the brave thing. And once you know you've done it, that bravery builds on itself. You have to give those early speeches and force yourself through the discomfort. But try and speak on things you already know about. Hopefully have a background that you feel like the words will find you. Those are the easiest things. Now, more specifically, because what you've asked is a really important question, there's platform speaking and there's informal speaking. Very few people in their lives spend a lot of time speaking at a lectern to a large audience, and there are specific things you need to do for that. I would say the biggest problems you have in platform speaking typically are controlling adrenaline and getting variation in your voice. Adrenaline is that fight or flight response is a great thing, but it's also dangerous to a speaker.
How is it dangerous? I know maybe you start stuttering, or you start losing your mind or something. You start blanking out.
There are, yes. And one of the two most common reactions with adrenaline are it's fight or flight. And sometimes it's flight, not fight. Mm-hmm. So what happens? You get up to speak and you freeze. And you want to get off the stage, and you begin to panic.
That's what everyone's afraid of, right?
Absolutely.
Making a fool out of themselves.
And that's why if you can speak on something you know about in your early speeches, obviously it sounds too easy. You want to speak on what you know about. But so often people pick a new area they want to speak in, or they don't have time to prepare. And if you know your material, it's easier to stop and pause and make yourself be composed. So obviously, stress and fear, people have lots of tricks for dealing with that. They imagine people in the audience in various states of undress. A really good one I find is if you wear a watch or something, when you start to speak and you get to the podium and you feel that rush of adrenaline, that wave of nausea coming over you, simply take a ring or take a watch and look down and give yourself 2 or 3 seconds. The rest of your senses are taking in the room, but you're also focusing on something else. And when you look back up, you're almost always a little more relaxed. So
really?
there are little tricks you can do. So for platform speakers, I would say controlling adrenaline is a huge issue. The second issue, and you are someone who's an award-winning voice actress, so you know this as well. Great speakers use their voice like a musical instrument. There are pauses, there's variation, the tone, the pitch, the volume. There's almost a musical cadence to a really good public speaker. And so finding that way to use your voice as an instrument, you're not just getting through your presentation, you're lingering over the words as much as you can. For platform speakers, controlling adrenaline and using your voice like an instrument are the two easiest ways to make rapid gains. Now, most of us are speaking across a table to someone. I would say in informal settings, the key to being a great speaker, being a great conversationalist, is being a great listener. Listening for cues, making the person across from you feel empowered, not mansplaining or drowning them out, when they're trying to get a word in edgewise. That's why people are considered great conversationalists, not just because they talk, but because they listen. And the conversation becomes a dialectic: thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the process begins again. Everyone's empowered, everyone's heard, and everyone's adjusting to each other.
What about in public speaking? How do you engage the audience? Is it also similar, like you have to know where they're coming from, what they need, what they're interested in, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. There's sort of different levels of engagement. There's, are they going to care what it is you're talking about? And to do that, you have to research your audience. You have to watch nonverbal reactions to what they're doing and be willing to adjust as much as you can in that regard to try and meet their expectations. But sometimes you just have to catch their attention. And one of my favorite introductions to a speech ever, it was a student where I teach at Taipei American School, was giving a speech, and we didn't know what the subject was on. And she walked in with an animal carrier, and inside of it was this really cute little dog. And so she set it down, and the class was cooing, and it was first period. Everyone was very tired, but this got them going. She went to the podium, and she said, "Oh, this is my dog. I brought my dog in. It's a puppy, though, and so it doesn't act very well, so sometimes I have to lock it in the closet or punish it or throw cold water on it when it's bad." And the class kind of looked at her, and she looked down and said, "Did you just bark at me?" And she turned and she kicked the carrier as hard as it could. It went flying against the wall. People jumped out of their chairs. They yelled. They swore they heard the dog cry out in pain. There was no dog. It was a stuffed animal in the carrier, and her speech was on animal rights. She had everyone in the palm of her hand after that. It was an amazing introduction. So sometimes you've got to be creative with your audience and confound their expectations. Other times you have to tap into what they want and the way they have to hear it. But there's no one size fits all. It's about being a good diagnostician, like a doctor, knowing how to diagnose a patient really well. A great speaker, they're watching their audience. For me, I rarely give speeches word for word off a text because I need the eye contact with the audience. I need the constant ongoing of what's working and what's not, and recalibrating based on that. I often tell clients I work with they have to be flexible and they have to be willing to adjust to their audience, but I had to teach myself a master's class in, of all places, the bathroom at the African Union building to get through a dicey situation. What had happened was I was living in the northeastern part of the United States, and I'd been asked to come down to give a speech at the African Union. I knew it was in association with preparing for some kind of a summit. As I arrived, I realized it was a much bigger gig than I expected. It was actually their ambassador-level meeting in the preparation for the Rio Plus 20 Summit on Sustainable Development, and I was a featured speaker. As I walked into the building, the head of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, a serious official, walked up to me and said, "I'm glad you're here. We've got a big problem." I said, "What's the problem?" And she said, "Well, a lot of the African delegates are not very happy that you're going to be speaking to them for 2 hours during this very busy negotiation session to tell them how to negotiate. They quite frankly feel like you're acting like the great white father coming to give the savages some information." And I was like, "Well, I can see that." And she's like, "Yeah, it's a big problem. They're thinking of walking out during your presentation."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, what should I do? Should I let them walk out?" And she grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Don't let them walk out. That can imperil our funding for the whole program for next year. You've got to keep them there somehow." And then she walked away. And I had like 10 minutes until my presentation.
Gosh.
So I went to the bathroom, shut the stall door, sat down, and thought about what I should do. And I thought about what it was they wanted. Okay, they wanted some information, they wanted respect, and they were time constrained. And so I thought, not my presentation, what do I want to say? Not even what does UNITAR want me to say. What do they need to hear? I walked back into the room, I walked to the lectern, I spoke to the parliamentarian and said, hey, I know you're pressed for time. How long would you like me to speak? And he just looked surprised. He said, 30 minutes? I'm like, no problem. He's like, you can cut it down to 30? And I'm like, absolutely, I'm here to serve you. He immediately walked over to the desk where all the government officials were. They started smiling and nodding. Okay. Then I started my presentation by saying, I'm an academic from an Ivy League school. You are real diplomats. I would never tell you how to negotiate, but you're about to sit down at the table with Western diplomats. And this presentation I'm giving has been vetted by 2 former U.S. ambassadors to the UN. This is the U.S. negotiating playbook. If you want to be able to beat them at their own game, you have to know what it is. Let me tell you in the next 30 minutes how they negotiate. And that presentation got a standing ovation and no one walked out. I got a high five from the head of UNITAR on the way out. It's not because I'm brilliant, it's because I was able to follow my own advice and go, what do they need to hear? And how can I repackage what I want to say in a way where my audience will really enjoy receiving it? And that's true as a speaker, as a negotiator, or a leader. You need to have that ability somewhere in your skill set.
So you basically said what you were going to say, but you said you
I just
introduced it in a different way.
Different packaging. Packaging often makes all the difference. I think that when Taiwan is talking about its relationship with the PRC, packaging is another example of where packaging is very, very important.
That's really fascinating. I know you've been in Taiwan for a few years. I'm curious what you think of our public speakers, our politicians.
Now, I'm hamstrung by the fact I don't speak Mandarin. I have to rely on translation. So I mostly deal with the nonverbal. And the style is much more subdued. It's not as bombastic. The displays of anger are not as present. I feel like in the United States, especially now, anger is almost a national sport.
That's Trump, right?
Yep. Well, it's not just Trump.
But that wasn't Obama, I think.
There's a feeling that righteousness equates to like how angry you are or how righteous you are is equated with the justness of your cause. If you have nothing to say or you don't say anything, it's because you have nothing to say. Whereas one thing I've noticed in dealing with Chinese negotiators is there's no need to fill space with talk. And there's no need to artificially pump emotion into situations that won't benefit from it. Sometimes you have to listen for the silences as much as for what's being said. I think that anger is reserved for very special occasions so that contrast is noted. And I don't think the move to anger, especially in the PRC, I think Taiwan is a special case. Anyone who's watched a video of activities in the legislature will tell you that anger is not parceled out quite as in a measured manner as it might be other places.
It's a constant.
The speech mechanics non-verbally are largely similar. I think the type of rhetoric that's used is different, and I think silences are used differently.
So is there any one last tip you'd like to give to our audience about public speaking?
Yeah, I would say that as unexciting as it sounds, there's no tool better to improve than forcing yourself to get out and do it a lot. There are clubs and organizations like Toastmasters out there that are preview lots of wonderful opportunities to give short speeches in a supportive setting. And someday when you're brave enough, and I think you would know this as well as I do, the thing you absolutely need to do is video analysis or audio analysis of your own speaking until you actually see all those odd gestures, the way you play with your hair, the habits you have. You'll never be aware of them. And your voice, I think you know this, the first time you hear your voice in a public setting,
you get scared. What's that? Who's that?
Well, it doesn't sound like it does in your head at all. It comes out differently. And so I think getting attuned to that, being brave enough to get out and speak a lot, because bravery builds on itself, and eventually doing a thorough scrubbing with video analysis will allow you to take your speaking to a whole different level. But it begins with bravery, continues with practice, and ends with fine-tuning.
Well, thank you very much, Nick.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Natalie.
That is Nick Coburn-Palo, an expert on public speaking and negotiation. He taught at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and is now teaching at Taipei American School. Nick also gave a TED Talk on why negotiations fail. Join me next week as we talk about the art of negotiation. Thanks for tuning in to Taiwan Today. I'm Natalie Tso.